Aaron, longtime friend of the podcast and now GQ columnist. Welcome back. How are you today?
Excellent. Much better having seen you again.
Well, likewise, a bit of a throwback, but it's always a joy having an hour or a bit with you. So you're already familiar with this question, but a lot has changed since we last spoke on the show. And I'd love to get your take on what you feel or sense is going on in the global human psyche, if we can think of that kind of frame.
Fear?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of fear going on. Like a lack of foundation, like things feel kind of shaky, things feel on the turn. I think people don't have a lot of... I think people are losing a little bit of faith that it's going to turn out all right, actually, at the moment. I think that's kind of how deep it's dropping just now.
Very interesting you say that. I've got a salon coming up, very ad hoc, in London in a couple of weeks' time, and it's about the Negretto and the descent and the kind of this idea of apocalypse is collapse renewal as two sides of the same coin of this eternal kind of cycle of death and life, which I really like as a framing. And I invited one of my friends who I really like, and he was like, "I'm sorry, darling, I don't agree with the premise." I'm like, "Oh, I'm so fascinated. What about this moment do you not feel is marked by some form of disintegration or descent?" And I haven't yet heard back, so I'm waiting because I'm very curious to hear what that picture or perspective might look like. What are the ways in which this is showing up perhaps in your practice or more broadly in society? So you're based in London right now, so maybe that's a good place to start.
So I think, like, in the clinical space, there have been several moments, like over the past 10 or 15 or 20 years, when kind of culture comes squarely into the therapy room. Like, a lot of the time, it doesn't take a lot of space, but sort of, Brexit came in quite a lot. The first Trump election came in, and now it's in the room as a kind of live action thing, and it's also something. It's not difficult to work with, but you can't grasp it psychologically individually like you can with what people generally tend to bring. And then I would say outside the consulting room, it's one of those things that comes up like, we probably shouldn't talk about politics, or we probably shouldn't do the world situation, and it's, it's just on everybody's mind all the time.
Yes. So moving from there to one of the biggest potential compounding issues of the broad use of AI, which still has some really shonky problems that haven't yet been ironed out and could potentially make things worse. Is AI showing up in your work much as a therapist, either as part of this kind of destabilization of what am I going to do? It's going to take my job, or from the flip side of actually it's been phenomenally useful and it's helping me in X and Y ways, and it's now my go-to confidant.
Are you asking me personally or kind of more broadly across the field?
However you want to answer, actually, whatever comes up.
Yeah, I mean, I think across the field there's a lot of fear. People who work in the talking therapies, because they're seeing, and it's more than just like, a lot of people are afraid that it's going to come take their jobs away. And I'm sure everybody who has a lot of passion for their jobs will feel similarly to what I might say about psychotherapy, right? But it's like, for us, it's also, it's not just a job. It's a really important, like, very human thing. And the idea that this very human meeting space that we provide to be taken over by a machine, and that already, there's pretty good evidence that really hordes and hordes of people are seeking it for that, is quite distressing to a lot of us.
I literally just had a conversation with someone I know who was saying that they had found it very helpful to submit diary entries that they'd written in digital form to ChatGPT to help them understand patterns about their relationships with particular individuals or particular themes. And I don't know if this person is using an enterprise version, but my first thought was, I really hope you're paying for this so that your personal data and these intimate details about your psyche and challenges or hopes or fears are not being just like sucked up by, OpenAI. But they were saying that actually it'd been phenomenally helpful. And of course it would be, in a sense, just because the pattern matching or the pattern recognition, I should say, of these sorts of platforms is phenomenal, especially when you're dealing with a lot of different entries and it would take someone quite a long time to go through. But then I was also reading a fascinating article in Business Insider that was talking about how so many people have taken to, it could be Claude, it could be ChatGPT, there's a whole host of different ones, and using things like voice journaling and changing their settings to make sure that they get a response in the voice of whatever bot they're using, mimicking a therapist, making it so naturalistic in a sense that it becomes almost indistinguishable. So you end up having hordes of people who are suffering potentially, who can't access a therapist because inflation, economic precarity, etc., who are then turning to the next best thing that's always on, that's always available, that mimics, in some cases, unconditional positive regard. And this boom in this kind of synthetic relational intimacy economy is just, I think I'm waiting for the shit to hit the fan. And also knowing full well that it can be incredibly powerful. So, but what parameter? I don't know. I think there's huge potential, but I'm worried about where we're at currently, that people are using it for something that it hasn't been legislated for, and people won't be protected if they use it in this way.
Yeah, I mean, some shit has already hit the fan, right? I mean, there was that teenager who killed himself last year based on a bad advice or a conversation that went the wrong way through an AI companion, and that's one that we know about. It's a tricky area because I really can see the value in having access to something when you're distressed or in pain. In some cases, in many cases, perhaps something is better than nothing. Yeah. But how are we making those choices? How much are those choices being made for us? We can just kind of never forget. And this is what happened, with social media, right? We cannot forget that all of this is based inside a capitalist system that is seeking to profit, right? And then you take your most vulnerable aspects of the self and you can make it emotionally addictive. We're kind of seeing this starting to happen, right? So is this good for people to keep them on platforms, opening up their guts? Who knows what's going on with that data, how that data can be manipulated back, for the aim of making a buck? I mean, I know it's not necessarily all about that, and I'm sure there are some great therapeutic platforms, which I might have some other kind of critical ideas about. But you really have to ask what the aim of these products are, and these hundreds of thousands of people that are using AI companions and paying for them, or sex chat bots or whatever it is, and being hooked in and staying in there, right, out of a profit-driven mechanism. You get the same thing with fast food, or junky content. We just live in a world where we can just feed ourselves on junk on so many different levels, and that's definitely not good.
It's tricky because I think it's also, you mentioned sort of the incentives there and working within capitalistic structures. And I think one of the things I find the most saddening and troubling is that a lot of the loneliness, a lot of the challenges we're facing would probably be supported and helped by actually having stronger actual communities, actual relationships with real people, where we have to learn to place boundaries and communicate clearly, and we have to come up against those edges and learn the hard, uncomfortable way sometimes, which is one of the things that therapy creates a space for us to be able to do. It's contained, but you end up with these kind of, at least I've certainly experienced this, where you end up in a place where you have to find a new way to respond to a specific situation if you're going to change the pattern, change the behavior. And I don't think that AI in its current state, Gen AI with this sort of sycophancy and the rest of it is in a place to do that. And the constant availability, I think it's more likely that we'll end up with a dependent relationship on something which initially feels exhilarating and freeing and supportive and exciting and insightful, kind of like social media did at the beginning. I was like, look at the possibilities, this is amazing. And then it got captured in various different ways, not through specific individuals particularly, but just because of the ways they were designed along the incentives of exploitation, essentially, at its extreme exploitation. But then the question, and I was planning on getting to this way later in the conversation, but are the questions around how we relate to technology, whether it's social media, which has AI components, or AI companions, are the questions that it's raising now questions that actually upstream lead us back to a deeper reckoning with systemic issues that we're facing? You mentioned capitalism already, but there's a whole host of other interlocking issues.
Yeah, I mean, I would probably put polarization at the center of that in this moment, and the contribution that social media, and AI, and let's say the passive consequence of algorithms, and then the manipulative use of algorithms as well. Okay, so how I see that as a whole, and I feel like, okay, so on the one hand, you take the psychotherapeutic point of view that you were talking about. It's like working through conflict and working through difference and sitting in discomfort between two people, right? It's a really hard task anyway.
Yeah.
In order for that to function, you have to have enough common ground, a willingness on both sides, and some basic principles that you can start from. Yeah. I think we are now living in a situation where we have societies living side by side, but they're not the same society anymore. So if you are a society that is imbibing Fox News and X propaganda, or I'm kind of, the American situation is just everybody knows about it and it's local, so we can talk about that, or MSNBC and Blue Sky, right? For example. The realities are just that they're getting further and further apart. Yeah, like you don't even have the same source of news, and when you look across to the other side, the depth of seeing the world completely differently becomes very, very quickly apparent. Like stuff that is just appalling to people on the left is being celebrated by people on the right, and neither side can really understand how the same, and and half of it's not even real. There's this manipulations and lies going on. So we're really like we're losing very quickly the opportunity to have a common platform, even in nation states where generally there was a whole like common content, right? Whether it was a television show everybody was watching, or the same 3 news channels that basically people were getting stuff from. So it's really a massive fissure that is now being further deregulated. So, I see the only solution has to be top down and some kind of regulation, but, I don't see that happening anytime soon, at least not from that part of the world.
I've been listening to, well, I don't know, and I don't remember his surname, because you know how you sort of get used to, this is classic hallmark of our times, when you get used to following someone because of their podcast or their social media handle. And this guy, Gary, I've totally forgotten his name. He's written a book about economics, and he has a very interesting perspective on ways in which economies can change, but it starts from the education of most of us who don't yet have a grasp of how economics works. And it was so interesting because a friend of mine who's into investing, she's like, you need to listen to this because this guy breaks it down in a way that makes a lot of sense. It's clear. The examples are good, and it's making it accessible to vast numbers of people who otherwise wouldn't understand how things work. I count myself among them. And I listened to this amazing episode that he did on the tariffs in the US and regressive tax, progressive tax, like all of these that, usually my eyes just glaze over. But there was something about the way that he talked about how the change that needs to happen in taxation reflects a wider systemic change that needs to happen, but it has to happen throughout the system, and enough people at, let's say, the grassroots level need to have an understanding of what's happening to them so they can then together collaborate to put pressure on the people who are doing the legislation. But it's not going to, no change will happen unless there's a critical mass of people who go, hang on, we get what's happening, this isn't really fair, it's driving us down into poverty, we need to have change. And so there's also that question of how do you create change that is meaningful and lasting when there's such an imbalance between people who have a great amount of power, like hyper agents, and those who have a lot less individual agency. Don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, I mean, my thoughts aren't particularly optimistic on that.
Crack open a beer already on a Friday afternoon.
A little bit. Yeah, I mean, I do have a lot more hope in local smaller networks, right? Yeah. But like, you just have to look back to, Cold War period where you had a critical mass, in Czechoslovakia as it was at the time. You had a critical mass in Hungary. You could have said you had I don't know if it was a critical mass, but you had a mass movement in China around Tiananmen, and they were all quashed by powerful forces, right? Like it's important where power lies and what power listens to. Now, I was talking to someone recently, and I said, the Third Reich was supposed to last 1,000 years, right? And I think it lasted 12, I think. So it's three US election cycles, right? So a lot shorter than they would have liked, which on the one hand is like, okay, things come and go. But, at the end of that, Europe was ruined, torn in half until quite recently, millions and millions dead. Yeah. It ran hot and it burned hot. Yeah. Now, where I think there's a safety mechanism in what you're talking about at the moment is, I think, and obviously could be wrong about this, but I feel like because we know our history and because we can communicate and see what's going on, I think in places like the States, which I think is very different from places like Russia, I think there is a critical mass that is so resistant to like the Handmaid's Tale world, right? I think it's much harder to shift into that because it's harder to brainwash a whole society, right? But whether we can recover the MAGA half in some kind of a way, probably not until, like what you said, until it really, really hurts. They turned against Hitler when only when the cities were being firebombed. There's a cult worship going on here that needs to be challenged at such a deep level if it's going to shift.
Honestly, not sure where to go from it because there's so many questions that brings up. And I think one of the questions also is just this, you mentioned fear at the beginning and this kind of the rockiness of foundations, that so many of the things that in more, I'd say probably imperial industrialized societies, it's been very easy for many people, not for all people, to kind of coast along thinking, well, and it's not that there isn't suffering and poverty, because obviously that is also true, but at least some things seemed stable-ish in the sense that we could rely on election cycles being slightly tampered with, but not too much as to derail a whole society, one might hope. Or pre-cancel culture, the fact that social media was there, but it couldn't really completely annihilate your reputation. And I'm talking about the sort of the negative side. Obviously, there are amazing positives to social media and all these different kind of. But what I'm driving at is that I don't think that the generations alive today, certainly the young ones, are equipped to, and I speak for myself again here, are equipped from experience to deal with uncertainty in a way that doesn't make us shut down, contract, and escape to our devices, in a sense. I don't know if you'd agree with that, or maybe challenge it, or yeah.
Well, it's the kind of dangerous part we were talking about in the beginning about kind of getting like glomming onto an artificially intelligent companion because it's kind of safe. It's a real kind of oh gosh, what's the expression? More fiat for the masses, right? It's like it sates people. I see. I think when I talk with younger people, I feel like the dissatisfaction of that solution is becoming very clear to a lot of them. Like it doesn't maybe less so on the AI side. I think we got to kind of find out what's going on there. But the way that technology is mediating relationships, the way people are dating through it, there's a whole renaissance in London at the moment, which are like IRL dating nights, where like people coming off their apps, going into pubs to play Jenga and speed date and like, like bringing it back because it's
like
so
old school.
yeah, it's so
Although better than old school.
Hopefully you get old and new school, right? Like apparently board games are coming back and like there's a whole new like people are creating all these kinds of new games. So I think there is something when people are honest with themselves about it that like it fundamentally becomes deeply unsatisfying. It's like comfort eating, it like feels good for a while, but then it just starts to feel a little bit sickly. And I think that's happening. So that's where I have some hope, and I think that there's pushback around it, but it's a similar thing as the other one. It's like it's gotta hurt enough before you turn against it, and it's in the interest of all these very powerful people and organization and technologies to keep finding ways around our turning against it to make them more interesting again, right? It's like an immune system. Like every time you develop an immunity to it, it comes up with something new.
So what are some of the things that you think we're relying too heavily on technology for that maybe would be better if we moderated a bit?
So I think that we are beginning to forget that we grow and develop through something called hard work and pain.
That's so catchy, Aaron. Everyone's going to be lining up to get that.
This is why psychoanalysis has always been so hard to sell. So, like Freud comes out in his sandwich board saying, turn your neurotic misery into ordinary unhappiness. It's like, great, I get to be ordinarily unhappy, like, fuck.
Brutal.
Yeah, it's a hard sell. And that's like, but okay, like, if you want to get fit, you go to the gym and you run, right? And it's just like, you're just not going to get fit unless it hurts a little. You're not going to learn something new unless you challenge your brain. You're not going to improve a relationship unless you work through conflict and difference. You're not going to be a thought leader if you're given your thoughts on a silver platter, all nicely formed by an AI, right?
Yeah.
So we make these things really easy for ourselves, and then we actually lose an edge. It dumbs us down. And because it's so hard to say to oneself or to others, if you want to grow, it's got to hurt. All right. If you really want to learn something, you got to put effort into it. People want to make a quick buck, right? They want to, they want to know everything all at once. How are you going to sell to people that there's that if it's hard work, actually the outcome is really appreciable, and if there isn't, it's generally not.
Yeah. I wonder, because I think there is something as well that connects perhaps with stage of life as well, where you start to realize that maybe the quick wins are not deeply satisfying. They might be satisfying at a different level. And then maybe at that point, the question becomes, okay, what does it mean to live a meaningful life? And part of the meaning is in the process and the discovery. And so I wonder if there's something there also about ways in which we learn. Because if you're doing something which is like on games night, for instance, you're learning social interaction, you're learning how to read cues. If you're in a classroom where learning has been considered carefully and elements of play are brought in, then a lot of the mechanisms that make technology so addictive, for good and for bad, could then be used to make learning more engaging, so that you stick out the hard bits because you know that the gains are going to be interesting because you're already kind of invested.
So
But
I
yeah,
think.
yeah. Go
Sorry,
on.
did you want to say more?
It's all right. Go on.
I think it's about really being critical about what pain points you're trying to solve, right? Because if you're trying to solve the pain points that you need, like no, like you can't take a form of hardness out of learning and it still be learning,
Yeah, yeah,
right?
yeah,
But, you could, as you were suggesting, amend or cater to different learning styles so that they're not so alienated or so that it's too hard, right?
yeah,
In the world of psychotherapy, it's all like, let's take the pain points away from people finding therapists, for example. Um, and like, okay, that's a really good area, but you don't want to take the pain out of psychotherapy, right?
yeah,
Because part of how you process your pain through psychotherapy is painful, and that is part of the healing process. And a lot of
yeah,
people mix those things up. So it's like, oh, if we take out any, if you're like a classical psychoanalyst or something, and it's just like, you know, if they're texting you, you've ruined the whole frame. You made it. All these funny reasons for like, actually, that's a nice pain point to remove, right? Like, I
yeah.
can't come to a session today, or I can choose my therapist more easily because I have access to all sorts of different people, all that kind
Mm.
of stuff. So yeah, take away the pain points that are painful and not a lot of good comes out of, but don't take away the pain points that are absolutely necessary for the
Yeah.
outcomes that you're looking for.
So that leads us beautifully into a dissection of synthetic relationships and how they might impact human connection, human nature, even our own sense of identity, our interiority. Um, what are you most interested in, curious about, fearful of when it comes to synthetic relationships?
It's a really big question because, okay, let me take it. Let me take it backwards.
Okay,
I'll make it a little philosophical, and then we'll work
great.
to the present. Okay.
Okay.
So I think what is really interesting on a philosophical level about this, and you and I have talked about this before, not on air, right? But that I have, very strong suspicions that, that there's no free will anyway, right?
Yes.
And that
Yeah.
actually, when you and I are engaging with each other in this spontaneous fashion, it really is. I'm not saying this is necessarily what I believe in, but I think it's very likely to me that these are just very, very sophisticated algorithms where we're doing something very similar to AI, which is making associations to words to each other, reaching back into our experience of the associations that we've made before and bouncing them back and forth off each other. And it feels like it's ours, but our brains are doing most of the work.
Yeah.
And the reason why I said I want to kind of start forward and move back is because we what we may be doing right now may be very much like having a relationship with a synthetic.
How, Aaron? How?
Because
In terms
we
of
are
working
just,
off probabilities and like just
yeah, we're just
running.
highly sophisticated language emotional machines bouncing off of each other, much more sophisticated than current AI is.
Mm,
um, that's just kind of a starting point that I want to come back from, because I prioritize human to human relationships. Despite
mm,
that, I don't have any evidence that that's the case. I think they're more important than artificial relations, and they're definitely messier. People are wetter, harder, hairier, softer,
this got X-rated very
angrier.
quickly.
Yes, but like I think the kind of like skin bag, idea of human beings, it, that messiness is part of what makes us human, right?
Yeah.
And at the moment, if you're having, and I will put in quotes, a relationship with a large language model,
Mm,
um, orally, AUR, or through text, um, that's a very slimmed down, not particularly complex relation that
yeah.
narrows like any kind of room for interpersonal complexity. There's only one subject in the room. The other thing is geared to meet the needs of that subject. So
Yeah.
avoiding things like conflict, not feeling understood, it's a little bit, it's a cheap kind of a relationship, I think.
Mm.
And I know there are people out there who have very real emotional feelings towards their AI companions. And I don't dispute that their feelings are real, but they are not reciprocated.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that is a problem, I'm afraid. I think that's a really big problem.
That's fascinating. I don't know that I knew that you felt that we were like essentially biological algorithms.
I, I'm not like signing up to that, right? But that is not off the planet. Like I think that's a pretty reasonable supposition to come to,
Yeah.
even though it feels different and I value human
Mm.
life.
It is
Who's
curious.
to
I
say
have
we're
thought
not doing
about,
this, you know?
yeah, well, but also to that point around about ways of responding. Two stories come to mind. One of them was when I was coming around from general anesthetic a few years ago for a minor intervention, and I remember turning when I actually when I was conscious of being aware. Bit of a tautology there, but when I was conscious of being aware, and I could actually, and my memory started, my short term memory started to kick back in because I was obviously awake and asking questions beforehand, but I hadn't quite come back online in terms of a temporal sort of thing. Anyway, when I was asking this question, and I looked at the doctor and I asked a specific question, and he looked at me, and the expression on his face to me clearly showed that I'd asked this question several times, and he was like, what's wrong with you, love? And then as soon as I saw his face, I was like, I've asked you this already, haven't I? And I had probably asked the question and asked him, I've asked you this already, haven't I? Multiple times. And that really struck me. I thought, it's so curious that my brain is so predictable that I would go to that same question and the same follow up and only be aware of it in the moment that I regain
Yes.
full capability. And the other thing that reminded me, just that comes up, that reminds me of this, is a friend of mine who's an author, several years older than me, whose father was suffering with Alzheimer's. And he had very poor short term memory, and yet was an amazing businessman in his day, very strategic, and had great advice. And so this friend of mine would go to visit his father, and he wouldn't necessarily be able to remember any of the details about what they'd previously discussed. But if in the moment he turned to his father and he said, okay, this is the situation, this is what I'm trying to achieve, these are the issues, challenges, dynamics, what would you suggest? The strategy part was able to come online somehow and give him really insightful advice. And this was a repeatable thing at this stage of his of his cognitive decline.
Mm-hmm.
But so that suggests to me that actually, and we know this from psychedelic research, that when you're using specific psychedelics, it dampens the activity in the default mode network. And that makes it easier for us to experience much more of the information before it gets filtered down or collapsed by our, I suppose, the things that make us able to predict and then run more efficiently with the energy that we have in our systems. So there is something curious about that. But I think there's more, I would like to think that there's more chaos and serendipity and room for inspiration in human beings. And maybe this is my desire for human exceptionalism or for mammalian exceptionalism, whatever, or, biological life. Is that just another form of exceptionalism? Do you think that that's actually quite speciesist?
I mean, I think we are exceptional. Like I would like. I think awareness. I think awareness of consciousness, awareness of death, love, hate. I think all of these things are exceptionally human, right? So I've no dispute with human exceptionalism. It might be a higher form of what we're developing in AI. Like I said, I don't know. But you said something interesting there. So like it's interesting. It's called the default mode network, right? Because that makes us sound like and it is default. That is where you will reflexively, draw on information and you will drive a car, whatever it is. But then you're talking about, something can happen from beneath that or from the other side of that that's outside the default mode, inspiration. So this is another thing. So we are embodied. Yeah. We have sensations. We have emotions, real ones, not just performative ones. So these are different kinds of data sets that we can draw on to do inspirational things.
Mm.
And what we know about AI at the moment is it can only be as brilliant as everything that we've already done that it's drawing on. And while it might make a really great, Van Gogh version of a Rembrandt, it's not going to come out with like the next new Matisse or the next new artistic moment, because it can only draw on what's come before and make those combinations. Now,
Yeah.
you could make an argument that that's also sort of what we do, right? We can only
Mm.
draw on what we know historically, but who can say what that spark of inspiration was that, turned into pointillism, for
Yeah.
example, right? These are
Well, and
really
often these are sort
interesting.
of issues or mutations in I remember, I think with Van Gogh, it's a kind of particular condition in the eyes that meant that form got represented in a particular way. So there's also those sorts of things where there's some kind of disruption to the default,
Yeah.
I guess, program that we tend to operate off, whether it's a cultural program, to use that language, or if it's a biological tendency that then gets disrupted.
Yeah, and then like I can talk about my favorite person now, right? So like
Go on.
this is what Freud was on about in the development of the unconscious from the psychoanalytic perspective, right?
Mm.
It's that you have your manifest level of cognition, understanding, emotion, and then you have this latent level, which is your unconscious, which is reproducing patterns or pulling you in certain directions that you
Mm.
are less aware of. Now, that's also in a way, that doesn't mean it's not kind of programmed in a way, because it comes from your early life experience, but it
Mm.
is outside of awareness. And I don't think AI has an unconscious, as far as everything would be in that model pre-conscious, so accessible to consciousness, but
Oh,
not
that's
unconscious.
interesting.
Whereas some people still don't believe it, which I think is strange. And I know it's kind of old school, but like we have an unconscious. You want to take the Jungian view, there's probably a collective element to the unconscious. The
Mm.
whole progression of society, all the scary stuff that we're going through, is probably some weird expression, of a cosmic unconscious that's rolling forward.
Mm.
I don't think AI. I think AI is participating in that in some way. Um, but it's not nearly as exciting as it is to be a human being.
So I'd love to hear some more about the cosmic unconscious.
I would too.
Sadly, we can't access it because it's unconscious.
Yeah, I mean,
But I'm
look,
curious what your thoughts are.
well, I think that there can be a kind of version of pantheism happening, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's like you and I have a particular kind of human consciousness that we share. We're asking questions about what an artificial intelligence represents in relation to uh, a conscious entity, right?
Yeah.
You got the whole bat consciousness thing. So there's the bat has its consciousness, the frog has its consciousness, the tree, the fungus has one. And yes, we're exceptional because as far as we're aware, we have awareness, but the frog is not aware of the cat consciousness, right? And the cat's not aware of the chimpanzee consciousness, and the chimp
Hmm.
isn't quite aware, maybe a little bit aware of the human consciousness. So on the one hand, I think it's completely reasonable that, that there's no free will. I would also say it's completely reasonable that there's a consciousness greater than ours that we're not aware of. And this is coming
Hmm.
from someone who's pretty dyed in the wool atheist, right? But I
Yes.
think that's a really
Yeah.
reasonable supposition, right? Which actually for me, and it's a little bit of I wouldn't call it like a religious escape, get out of jail free card. But for me, that actually mitigates a lot of my fear about where everything is going,
Huh.
not out of a trust that everything's going to come out right, but out of a sense that this consciousness agreement, our conventional world that we're all in, really doesn't have the final say, and ultimately probably has very little to say in relation to whatever cosmic event is going on. And while there's a lot of suffering to be had inside this like tiny little raindrop in the universe, ultimately it is a tiny little raindrop in the universe, and the universe is just going to carry on progressing however it progresses. And I think that's really interesting and unknown and curious.
So there's something there as well about, as I'm hearing it, and I've known you for many years now, but like this capacity and desire to lean into the mystery and not to have everything answered. That there's some sort of beauty and possibly solace in that.
I mean, I think, it's easier to say when you're sitting comfortably, right?
Yeah, yeah,
And not
yeah.
not being deported to South America, and you have to find something. And I always go back to Viktor Frankl because he was there, right? He was in Auschwitz, and this thing that really helps me, which I'll paraphrase, is don't ask what you should expect from life, but what life expects from you. And it turns that whole thing upside down. And for me, it's like, okay, that is really a challenge. Like that is really like, it's super narcissistic to tell life what you expect from it and then be disappointed when it doesn't provide, which is like what we all do. But when you turn it upside down and you think, this is the landscape, and I'm expected to respond to this landscape,
Yeah.
right? And whether that means, rioting in the streets, or writing letters, or collaborating, or putting your head in the stand, or just being interested, that there are all different ways you be with that. There will probably be a reckoning afterwards about how you were with that. But that's the challenge. And you can't get around it, right? You can't get around
No.
that the landscape is expecting you to respond to it. So at least in that existential sense, make a choice, and don't make a choice from the fucking default mode network, right? Because it is not default mode at the moment, right? You really have to dig deep and choose something, I think.
That's really moving. And I'm also struck by how there can be these kind of these points of fissure, or in my mind's eye, I see like you see sort of an earthquake, or when there's been a lot of dry, like a long dry spell, and you look at the earth and it's cracked and there's a fissure that opens up. And the idea of like frantically taping over it and just thinking that everything's fine, or like painting over mold, or like what, any of these sorts of,
Mm-hmm.
there is something that is structurally shifting and breaking apart and changing. And one of the ways in which we can look at it, one of many of the ways, is initiation. And I really like this, especially in modern day capitalistic societies where we don't have much in the way of initiatory or liminal moments, these threshold moments where you're between one place and the next, and there's a contact with mystery. There's a sense of, like, for instance, I was talking about this with someone the other day, this wonderful musician Sam Lee, talking about May Day, where historically things would be really inverted. So the lord of the manor would become the servant, and the servants would become the lords, and the rest of it. That we don't have many of those sorts of liminal contexts in which all of the things that we assume are flipped on their heads or just dismantled, which is one of the reasons that I think we like festivals so much in the UK as well, that it kind of speaks somehow to that, speaks to other things too, but to that sort of need. And I wonder if there are ways or practices of helping people, rather than disappear into the comfort of our phones and that kind of, sort of junky attention or whatever. There's a way to actually put that aside for a bit, look at the fissures that are opening up, and then show up differently in response to what you just described, which is, well, what can I bring here? Who can I be? How can I meet this moment in a way that's ultimately going to feel more meaningful, I think.
Yeah, you've made me have a really interesting thought. I was thinking about Joseph Campbell, and his expression that the dream is the personal myth, and the myth is the global dream or social dream. Yeah.
Ooh.
And he consulted with George Lucas around the Star Wars movies, because our our myths that we seek out are quite old now, like Greek
Yeah.
myths, and we don't tend to relate to them. So it's supposed to be like a myth for whatever, the
For the modern
1970s or
age.
whatever. Yeah. But actually, when you were speaking, I was thinking, well, we're living a really crazy myth.
Yeah.
Like, it's real, which is frightening, but like there are like real, like you know real bad guys and real good guys, and like real visceral threat, and things are changing very, very fast, and everybody's like, we're all on this boat together, whether we
Mm,
like it or not, at this very particular moment in time. And maybe
mm,
it's not about kind of creating a ritual like a new kind of a baptism or a firewalk or something like that, though I think they have their place, but actually how we participate
mm,
in. Now what scares me about this is there are a lot of people for whom the myth is the second coming, right? Which is a global catastrophe, and a lot of the religious right in America, it's related to what's going on in Palestine and Israel, that they're bringing forth the old myth of the destruction of the world as we know it to make room for the kingdom of heaven. There are people who think that
wow.
Trump is like chosen by God, to bring, and that's like a really dangerous. Sorry for all the people who believe in it, right? But it's like, I think that's a really old, dangerous myth that is not suited
Mm,
for our times, right?
yeah.
And that's why I think the moment is so dangerous. But that they do not have the monopoly on how this rolls out or what it means.
Mm.
And in there, I think lies some potential.
So I'm curious what other myths, if there are myths that we can draw upon, would be helpful to hold in mind at this moment, or do we need to conjure new myths? And then the kind of the questions around roles of artists and writers and those who have kind of that access to imagination made manifest.
Yeah, well, I'm thinking about that expression that I don't know exactly what it is, but sort of, you don't really know, somebody's true character doesn't show up unless they're up against a wall or sort of, really challenged in a particular kind of
Mm,
a way, where there's something on the line.
yeah.
So I actually think there are personal myths, right? So our narratives based on these mythemic principles like the wounded healer or hubris, the fatal flaw, the challenges of Hercules, that they all resonate with each other.
Mm,
That if you throw Frankel in with myth, with Campbell and Freud and Jung, you get, okay, what does life expect from me in this moment, and what is my mythic quest here? What am I being challenged to show up for that I don't want to? What would be a repetition of an old pattern
mm,
that I want to do differently in relation to this? I think in a way, even though it's a very social global problem, there's a really individual myth that's going to be playing out in each person, because they also replicate in some ways in the Freudian universe, like the bad father and the nurturing mother, and like playing out of like really archaic family circumstances,
mm,
sibling rivalry in the right and left, wanting to get the attention of the king. And then kind of in that Jungian world, it's much more sort of a collective growing force of individuation, right? How do I, it's not really about my dad, but it's about the symbol of fatherhood or motherhood or responsibility. So I'm kind of getting excited thinking about it in a way, because it's like, yeah, shit's got real. It's not really theoretical anymore. I think you really
yeah.
do have to
Yeah.
do something, and I'm not saying that something is, necessarily look like an activism that you're familiar with, right? It's got to
Mm,
be your individuated response to the world that takes responsibility for the choices you want to make, knowing what's going on. You know, it could be something like the conversation that we're having. It could be much more direct action.
yeah. I've been thinking recently about Well, I'm going to this gathering at Plum Village in a few weeks. No, end of May. This will probably be out by then, I think. But one of the things that I found really interesting is getting to know a little bit more, because I'm not a Buddhist, but I've always had a real affection for the principles being so clear and not needing to have necessarily, depending on how you look at it, any kind of religious structure around it. And so one of the quotes that I really like from Thich Nhat Hanh was this particular phrase, which is, "Don't just do something, sit there." And I love that inversion, because you kind of go, wait, what? But there is also something to that. And it links back for me to something that you mentioned earlier about that kind of discomfort and being able to sit in the awkwardness and the discomfort, and taking the time and the space to be able to be with whatever's going on and start to relate to it differently. And I think that seems to me to be a very powerful practice that we think, it's quote unquote unproductive, and it's not necessarily optimizing our time for performance and efficient, like all of this. Even the whole kind of mindfulness approach, I think, has been fairly co-opted in terms of how to make money. But something as simple as that, which is radical and restful and about observation, and witnessing, I think if we could find space in our days or create space in our days to just do something simple like that, things might start to shift. And then there's space for something else to arise.
Well, I think the curse of the world at the moment is reactivity. And I think a lot of our technology pushes us into reactivity and public reactivity, and that becomes kind
Yeah.
of default mode network stuff, right?
Yeah.
So responsibility, which comes from the place that you're talking about. So I think sit, then do, because I think you can
Yeah.
also hide in sitting.
Oh, yeah, totally.
Yeah. So sit and then do. But one of the things I also really like about the partnership between psychoanalysis and Buddhism is that in psychoanalysis we talk about the observing ego. So the way you overcome these painful repetitions is to be able to see yourself doing that, to have
Yeah.
awareness of the unconscious process. And the witnessing that comes in Buddhist meditations, to watch your thoughts, to watch your feelings, to become unattached to being reactive to them,
Yeah.
so that you can make this choice. And that's where, you know, that's where there's an opening against my no free will argument, except it's not really, because the capacity to stop and be responsive may also be predicated on all sorts of life experience that's also determined. But it is another layer of witnessing, aware, responding rather than just reacting out of old tired algorithms, you know.
I'm not sure where to take this next then, because we've gone completely down a different path than a very interesting path, especially the part around the cosmic unconscious.
Yeah, to
So
get a
let's
bit cosmic, didn't it?
I love it. This is great. A stomping ground. So I think what I'd like to ask next is actually, are there things that you think would be helpful for folks who are listening to this to be able to do, like processes and practices, or to allow themselves to digest what's going on without becoming too overwhelmed, and to come to that place of responsibility?
Mm-hmm.
Because that can be quite a challenging thing to do. Are there practices that from your clinical practice you'd recommend that are helpful?
So again, what I think is getting lost, or we have a lot less of, is, interpersonal complexity. So being with whole other people and engaging with them and being in relationship with them. And the really important aspect of that isn't just like practicing relational skills, but that you actually, and this is like from bog standard developmental psychology, you actually become aware of who you are through the reflections of other people's eyes, right?
Yeah.
Through mirroring, through people responding to your unique expression of self. You discover yourself between yourself and somebody else.
Yeah.
And that's really foundationally important in the early years. And that's where we create that the habits, good or bad, that dog us for the rest of our lives. But then there's that plasticity and becoming aware of that stuff. But that's a lifelong process. So you always have to put yourself in the way of people to carry on discovering who you are. It's the great thing about like a long-term therapy. This one person, you're discovering who you are because this is an actual person who is different from you, who's reflecting that back, getting it wrong sometimes, something AI isn't going to do for you. So if you're interested in self-discovery, you can't do that on your own.
Yeah.
Yeah. And while there is a benefit to sitting alone on a hill meditating, in some ways that's easier than managing complex other minds. Yeah. So I would say we're not going to change the world on our own. We're going to change it together. Find people with similar values, but not same structures, because you also don't want to, silo and filter bubble yourself. And do with, find people to meet this challenging world with, find nutritious, nourishing people to meet it with, and try to avoid the junk food relations that happen on social media, the junk food distractions that we all love, on our Instagram reels, and, a little bit of junk food every now and then is fine.
Yeah.
I think it's only going to happen through deeper interpersonal connection.
Okay. And so maybe that's kind of laid the ground for this penultimate question, but how do you orient yourself towards vitality and beauty when things are really challenging?
I look into the eyes of my dog.
I know you do. Is Quinny there right now?
Yeah, he's looking at me. Hey, sweetheart.
Oh.
And yeah, it touches me. Actually, I know it sounds kind of crazy, but it's just like there's this just bundle of unconditional soppy love who likes to, sniff the grass and is just a piece of manifestation. Gives me hope. So me, I'm like a very cognitive minded person, right? So actually, seeing someone who doesn't have a thought in his dopey little brain.
Oh, bless him. I'm sure he has thoughts. They're probably feelings more than thoughts.
I've had smart dogs before. This is not one of them.
Bless him.
Yeah. But smart's not always great. So it's nice to kind of dumb down, feel your body, get out in nature, all the usual stuff, right? I know it's kind of cliche, but I just dare anyone to go to an ocean and put their feet in the sea and look out at this vast horizon and not feel differently, other than looking at a screen and reading bad news. Ground yourself with people, with animals, with the physicality of the world, quiet the noise. I don't always do it well, but I like it. I also like, a neat whiskey every now and then to dull the pain. So there's the junk food approach as well. Yeah.
No, you can get some great whiskies. Well, I'm very much looking forward to a cheeky whiskey with you at some point sooner rather than later. So if people want to learn more about your work, where can they find you, including the GQ column?
Yes, there'll be more of those coming out. Just you can check out my website, which is my name, aaronbalick.com, and I'm on Blue Sky, LinkedIn, that sort of thing.
All right, wonderful. Yeah. Well, Aaron, thank you so much.
And Natalie's amazing podcast.
Thanks for the plug.
You can find me here.
It's a bit self-referential, but fine. Amazing. Well, you are one of the things that gives me the most joy. So thank you so much.
I enjoy you very much too, Natalie.
All right, over and out.